Good morning. Today we look at Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 21. And again, this starts in those days when there was again a great crowd around Jesus without anything to eat. He called his disciples and he says, I have compassion on them. And, not all of the Gospels have the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Mark does. Some scholars will say that, well, no, it was just one time that it happened, but if that's true, then why did Mark put it in twice? If he was indeed one of the disciples, which is also questionable. There's so many questionables, but the reality to me is that these Gospels are inspired by God for you and for me, for our belief and trust in Jesus. But anyway, it says that, Jesus tells the disciples, I have compassion because they've been with me for 3 days now and have nothing to eat. And you think about that. These crowds, how many of us would be able to, go on an extended trip, and have enough food along? Not very often. But these people were following Jesus, listening to his teaching, bringing some of them journeying quite a distance, bringing sick and deaf and blind and, people that needed Jesus healing. So they were coming and looking for Jesus and to hear his teaching. And, Jesus says, if I send them away hungry, they will faint on the way. Some of them have come, as I said, a great distance. And this is very true. And the disciples, it was just a couple chapters ago, I think Mark 6, that Jesus fed, the 5,000, the end of chapter 6. And so here again, the disciples are not remembering. But he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And here now, then this time they have 7 loaves. It doesn't talk about fish, but they order them to sit, and they distribute them. Well, it does say in verse 7, they had a few small fish. That was an afterthought, it seemed like. But, they gave all of this, and all of the people ate, and there was enough left over. Verse 10, immediately then he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district. This version says Dalmanutha, and others will say Magdala or Magida, because this Dalmanutha, as this Bible says, is an unknown area. They don't know where that town or that area would be, but others have a different spelling in there. But again, he got there, and the next verse, the Pharisees came and began to, it says, argue with him. They didn't ask him questions, but they began to argue with him. And they were arguing, it says, they wanted a sign from heaven to test him. And it says he sighed deeply in his spirit. And, when we've all been asked a stupid question, or what we think is a stupid question, or a rhetorical question, and, we sigh at, why did you ask that again? Or how can you not know yet? And this was Jesus. They've been seeing his miracles. They've been hearing his teaching. And then they come and they ask for a sign, and it's, this sigh of, don't you get it? Kind of. And, and then he says, why do you ask for a sign? I tell you, I will give you no sign. And other places, I will give you only the sign of Jonah. And the sign of Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days. And Jesus, the sign was not yet, but it would come that Jesus was in the grave for these 3 days. But after this, just a short, verse 11 and 12 talks that way. And then verse 13, he left them and got into the boat and went over to the other side. And as they're in the boat, it says, then the disciples forgot to bring any bread along. They didn't have anything to eat. And then it's just kind of, my mind goes to, well, they're fishermen. They could catch some fish. But then, you don't really want to eat raw fish when you're out in a boat either. And you can't really start a fire in a boat to cook them, especially those, today, and so many ships and everything out. But, you just, fishing wasn't in the cards for getting something to eat, but the disciples were confused by Jesus' conversation with them. He said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And, leaven, yeast, when you put it into something, it affects everything. So Jesus is saying to them, be aware of the teachings of the Pharisees. Be aware of some of the traditions of the Pharisees. Be aware of some of the practices of the Pharisees, some of the requirements. But, to be paying attention more to what God's word is than the word of the Pharisees. And he says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And, at first they think, well, it's because we forgot to bring bread. We didn't bring food. But, Jesus then becomes aware of their thoughts. Of it, he's saying this because of our lack of bread. Well, he isn't saying it because of that. He's saying it because of so many people's lack of understanding, a lack of being able to accept that Jesus is the Son of God. And, he says, do you still not perceive and understand? Are your hearts hardened? You have eyes, you fail to see. You have ears, you fail to hear. And do you not remember? Here they've got, that says they have no bread. Well, Jesus says, don't you remember I fed 5,000 people and I fed 4,000 people with just a little bit? Don't you think that I can take care of your needs? And they responded both times. You remember the feeding of the 5,000? How much was left over that you collected? Well, when we fed 4,000, how much was left over? How much did you find, excess? And Jesus questioned to them in verse 21. He said to them, do you not yet understand? And, in John's gospel, Jesus, in one of the I am statements, says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of heaven, and he came, to feed the empty void in us, to fill this need of love and grace. He came to teach us about God. He came in so many ways to show us God's love and God's grace. And the gospel lesson for this coming Sunday, the second Sunday in Lent, is John 3, 1 through 17. And you know what verse that encompasses, right? Yeah, John 3:16. And it's, Jesus came to fill this void within us. We all have a need to be accepted. We have a need to be loved, to be appreciated. And no matter how much of an, introvert you are, you have a need for some companionship, some, just to be a total loner is such there's such a void in your life that way. But Jesus said that I came to fill all of those voids. I came to fill the need for your love and grace and forgiveness. These people, especially in Jesus' day, they were under Roman rule, and they were exploited very much, by the taxation, by the lacks of freedoms that they had. They were under the vision, the eyes, the oversight of the Pharisees, who were, extremely careful and zealous about enforcing all of the laws. You can't travel very far. You can only go 150 feet from your home or whatever. It's a little bit further than that, but and you can't pick any heads of grain. You can't. And when you keep getting told you can't, it gets really hard after a while. But Jesus has come to tell us that we can live in God's love, that we can have God's grace and forgiveness, that we don't have to be perfect before we come to God, because if we had to be perfect, we'd never be able to come. But Jesus comes to tell us that I've come to fill the needs of your life. And it isn't just the bread. And that's during the temptation when Satan said, command these stones to be turned into bread that you may eat. Jesus says, you don't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So we need God's word in our lives. We need God's love. And Jesus came to embody God's love for us, to show us the extent of God's love and grace, and to show us the extremes to which God goes for you and for me.